There is a particular refinement to the most dangerous illusion in history. It is not crude. It is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is the belief that collapse is gradual, that great powers decay politely, that decline announces itself early, that there is always time to reform, to correct, to stabilize. This belief has comforted every civilization that would later be stunned by how abruptly its world ceased to function. History, examined without sentiment, tells a harsher truth. Empires do not usually end in long, gentle descents. They fracture, and they do so with a speed that feels almost obscene to those living inside them. The final moments rarely resemble the decades that preceded them. They feel discontinuous, unrecognizable, sudden. This is why collapse is so often misunderstood, even by the educated, the informed, the powerful. The human mind expects symmetry. It assumes that long decline must produce a long ending. History offers no such reassurance. Consider Rome. By the early 5th century, Rome was visibly weakened. Its borders were porous, its currency diluted, its politics corrupt. Yet for nearly 8 centuries, one thing had never happened. The city itself had never fallen. Not once. That fact was more powerful than any legion. It shaped how Romans thought, how they calculated risk, how they interpreted danger. Rome did not merely rule the world. Rome felt eternal. Eternity is a dangerous assumption. In the summer of 410, that assumption collapsed. Not gradually, not heroically, not after a final glorious defense, but quietly, through betrayal, exhaustion, and internal decay. For 3 days, the center of the known world was looted. The shock was not military, it was metaphysical. Rome had been violated, and once that belief shattered, the empire that depended on it could no longer hold. What followed was not immediate annihilation. It was something more corrosive, loss of confidence. Local authorities began acting independently. Loyalty fractured. Coordination dissolved. The empire still existed in name, but the idea of Rome, the organizing principle, was gone. This distinction matters because empires do not collapse when they lose territory. They collapse when they lose belief. The same pattern reappears centuries later. In the early 20th century, a continental power possessed one of the largest, most respected armies in existence. Its doctrine was admired. Its fortifications legendary. Its confidence absolute. Within 6 weeks, the government fled. The army disintegrated. The nation ceased to function as a sovereign entity. Not years, weeks. The speed of that collapse paralyzed those who lived through it, because nothing in their experience had prepared them for it. The institutions still existed. The buildings still stood. The uniforms were still worn. But belief evaporated. Orders were issued and ignored. Authority spoke and was doubted. The system stopped coordinating itself. This is how collapse actually unfolds. Not with noise, but with silence. Another empire, later still, commanded half a continent. It possessed vast natural resources, an immense security apparatus, and weapons capable of ending civilization itself. Yet within a handful of years, it simply dissolved. No invasion, no decisive battle, no final stand. The system stopped being obeyed. The center could no longer compel the periphery. The narrative lost credibility. Participation became performative. Once again, belief died first. These three examples differ in ideology, culture, and era, but they share a structure: long stagnation, mounting contradictions, and then sudden failure. This should disturb us, because it reveals something deeply counterintuitive. Power does not prevent collapse. It accelerates it when belief breaks. An empire is not a collection of assets. It is a coordination mechanism. It relies on trust, in currency, in institutions, in leadership, in tomorrow. When that trust exists, societies tolerate extraordinary strain. When it vanishes, even immense power becomes irrelevant. This is why collapse feels sudden, because what fails is not infrastructure, it is expectation. Imagine a dam. For years, pressure builds behind it. Engineers issue reports. Small cracks appear. Maintenance is deferred. Warnings are debated. But the dam still stands. People live beneath it. They walk past it every day. It has always been there. Until the moment it is not. When the dam fails, it does not leak gently. It collapses all at once. The downstream destruction feels instantaneous. Yet the causes were accumulating silently for years. Empires behave in precisely this way. The early signs are technical: debt ratios, institutional inefficiency, erosion of social trust. They do not feel existential. They feel manageable. This is why denial is so powerful. Denial does not mean ignorance. It means selective attention. Elites reinterpret danger as noise. Experts reassure. Media normalizes dysfunction. And ordinary people, understandably, want to believe them. Because believing is less disruptive than accepting uncertainty. This is the psychological foundation of collapse. Before collapse becomes political or economic, it becomes emotional. People sense something is wrong, but they cannot yet articulate it, so they adapt individually. They hedge. They disengage quietly. They prepare privately while participating publicly. This behavior is rational. It is also fatal at scale, because coordination requires trust, and trust cannot survive widespread private exit. Collapse accelerates when people stop believing the system will protect them tomorrow. At that point, long-term thinking disappears. Everyone acts defensively, short-term, locally, individually. The collective future dissolves. This is why collapse is not linear. It accelerates. Slow erosion suddenly becomes freefall. Rome did not fall in a century. It fell in days. The Continental Army did not disintegrate over generations. It dissolved in weeks. The superpower did not unravel over decades. It vanished in months. And each collapse occurred in a world far slower than ours. Information traveled slower. Capital moved slower. Narratives changed slower. Today, everything moves at the speed of instant perception. confidence can evaporate globally in hours. Which raises an unsettling question. If collapse accelerates, as systems become faster and more interconnected, what does collapse look like in a world where everything is immediate? Before we attempt to answer that, we must understand collapse properly, not as catastrophe, but as process. In the next part, we will examine the precise phases through which empires fracture, not rhetorically, not emotionally, but structurally. Because recognizing these phases is the only way to understand when decline has crossed the threshold into irreversibility. Collapse does not announce itself as catastrophe. It announces itself as adjustment. This is why it is so often misread. The early stages feel technical, managerial, almost dull. Budgets are revised, institutions are restructured, language becomes cautious rather than confident. Nothing appears dramatic. And yet, this is precisely where collapse becomes inevitable. History shows that the most decisive damage occurs long before panic, violence, or visible disorder. It occurs when systems lose the capacity to correct themselves honestly, when problems are acknowledged rhetorically but not addressed structurally, when adaptation is delayed in order to preserve appearances. The first true phase of collapse is denial, not ignorance. Denial is sophisticated. It wears the language of expertise. It presents itself as prudence. In declining empires, denial is rarely imposed from above. It is shared. Leaders reassure because they want to believe reassurance. Experts qualify warnings because certainty feels irresponsible. Institutions reward those who minimize risk, rather than those who confront it. This creates a culture of managed optimism. Problems are real, but never urgent. Serious, but not existential. Correctable, but not now. This phase can last for decades. In late antiquity, administrative correspondence was filled with promises of reform. Tax systems would be improved. Currency stability would be restored. Military loyalty would be secured. Each proposal was rational. None addressed the core problem: loss of confidence. Confidence, once eroded, cannot be legislated back into existence. In the early 20th century, military institutions clung to doctrines that had worked before. Evidence of change was acknowledged, then neutralized. New realities were interpreted through old frameworks. This is a common institutional reflex. Systems prefer reinterpretation to transformation. Transformation threatens identity. Reinterpretation preserves it. The second phase, when denial can no longer contain reality. This is the moment of credibility fracture. Something happens that cannot be explained away, not because it is unprecedented, but because it is public. Visibility matters. A defeat witnessed rather than reported. A financial failure felt directly rather than abstractly. An institutional breakdown that affects daily life. Once credibility fractures, trust collapses asymmetrically. Some people lose it instantly. Others cling desperately. This divergence accelerates fragmentation. In Rome, the sack of the city was not militarily decisive, but it was symbolically devastating. The idea of inviolability vanished. Local elites began preparing for autonomy. Allegiance became conditional. The center still issued commands, but obedience became optional. In modern terms, this is the moment when participation shifts from belief to calculation. People no longer ask, "Is this legitimate?" They ask, "Is this still useful to me?" That question is lethal to empires. The third phase is cascade. Here, failure propagates faster than response. Institutions depend on each other. Finance supports governance. Governance supports security. Security supports trade. Trade supports revenue. Revenue supports everything. When one link weakens, stress transfers immediately. Attempts to stabilize one area create pressure elsewhere. This is why late-stage reforms often fail. They are too narrow. They treat symptoms rather than structure. In late Rome, attempts to stabilize currency worsened taxation. Increased taxation accelerated rural flight. Rural flight reduced revenue. Reduced revenue weakened the army. The system chased stability and found only acceleration. Cascades feel chaotic to those experiencing them, but they are structurally predictable. Complex systems fail not at their weakest points, but at their points of greatest interdependence. This is why collapse often surprises experts. Experts focus on isolated indicators. Collapse emerges from interaction. The fourth phase is fragmentation. This phase is particularly deceptive because fragmentation can feel like resilience. Local solutions emerge. Regional authorities take initiative. Communities adapt. For a brief moment, life appears to stabilize. This creates false optimism. People mistake decentralization for recovery. In reality, fragmentation marks the end of coordinated power. The empire still exists symbolically, but functionally, it is gone. In late antiquity, authority became regional. Law varied by location. Military loyalty became transactional. The empire no longer acted as a single organism. Once coordination is lost, scale becomes a liability. Large systems require coherence. Without it, they collapse under their own weight. The fifth phase is freefall. This is where collapse becomes visible to everyone. Economic disruption intensifies. Public services fail. Crime increases. Social trust evaporates. This is the phase most people imagine when they think of collapse. But by this point, collapse is already complete. Freefall is consequence, not cause. The final phase is reset. Every collapse produces a successor order, sometimes through reform, more often through conflict. Always reduced in scale and ambition. The old empire never returns. It survives only as memory. This sequence has repeated with remarkable consistency. Different eras, different cultures, same structure. What changes is speed. Each iteration collapses faster than the last. Because systems grow more complex, more interconnected, more dependent on trust. Trust is the hidden architecture of power. It cannot be measured easily, but once it fractures, everything built upon it follows. The greatest mistake societies make is assuming strength is material, that armies, wealth, or technology guarantee continuity. They do not. They amplify whatever belief exists. When belief is strong, power stabilizes. When belief breaks, power accelerates collapse. This is why collapse is often misdiagnosed. People search for enemies, for external shocks, for singular causes. But history shows that empires rarely die from attack. They die from internal incoherence, from the inability to align expectation with reality, from the refusal to adapt early because adaptation threatens identity. This is not a moral failure. It is a structural one. And it is deeply human. The purpose of studying collapse is not prediction. It is recognition. Recognition of when decline has crossed into irreversibility. When reform becomes too narrow. When credibility, once lost, cannot be restored through rhetoric. In the next part, we will bring this analysis closer to the present, not through alarmism, but through careful structural comparison, to understand why modern systems feel stable, right up until they don't. There is a peculiar arrogance embedded in modern confidence. It is rarely stated aloud. It does not posture. It does not boast. It simply assumes continuity, the assumption that because systems have endured complexity, they must therefore be resilient to it. History suggests the opposite. The more intricate a system becomes, the less margin it possesses. The more efficient it grows, the more catastrophic its failures. This is not a criticism of progress. It is an observation about structure. Modern systems are masterpieces of coordination. They rely on timing, trust, and invisible synchronization. They function brilliantly until they don't. When they fail, they do not fail locally. They fail everywhere at once. This is the defining characteristic of contemporary fragility. Earlier empires collapsed within slower worlds. Messages traveled by horse. Capital moved with friction. Decisions unfolded over seasons. Today, perception itself has velocity. Belief can evaporate globally before institutions have time to respond. This alters the mathematics of collapse. In complex systems theory, there is a principle often misunderstood. Stability does not mean resistance to change. It means the ability to absorb shocks without losing coherence. Highly optimized systems sacrifice absorption for efficiency. They remove redundancy. They centralize control. They streamline variation. This increases performance. It also increases brittleness. History's great collapses occurred when systems mistook efficiency for resilience. Late imperial administrations prided themselves on precision. Supply chains were refined. Bureaucracies expanded. Control became more detailed. But detail is not depth. When stress arrived, these systems lacked flexibility. They could not bend, only break. This pattern is not antiquated. It is timeless. Modern institutions are astonishingly capable, within expected parameters. They excel at managing continuity. They struggle with discontinuity. And collapse is discontinuity. This is why moments of crisis feel surreal, because the scripts no longer apply. Procedures exist, but they are mismatched to reality. Authority speaks, but language feels hollow. Reassurance sounds rehearsed. People sense the gap. They may not articulate it precisely, but they feel it. And feeling precedes belief. One of the most revealing moments in any system under stress is the emergence of performative stability. Institutions continue functioning outwardly. Announcements are made, processes are followed, but inwardly, confidence has shifted. Decisions are delayed. Responsibility is diffused. Risk is transferred rather than resolved. This creates a theatre of normality, the appearance of control without its substance. Such moments are deeply dangerous because they prolong exposure. They encourage reliance on systems that are no longer trustworthy. In history, this is the phase where collapse accelerates unnoticed. Because collapse does not require chaos. It requires misalignment. When expectations exceed capacity, trust erodes. When trust erodes, participation becomes conditional. But capability without coordination is. But capability without coordination is inertia. Empires fall when they can no longer act collectively, when decisions fragment, when interests diverge, when belief becomes private rather than shared. This fragmentation does not require ideology. It requires uncertainty. Uncertainty breeds individual optimization. People act sensibly for themselves. Institutions act defensively. Short-term incentives dominate. No single decision is catastrophic. The catastrophe emerges from accumulation. This is why collapse is often invisible until it is irreversible. Because every step makes sense locally. Another defining feature of modern fragility is narrative saturation. Information abundance does not produce clarity, it produces noise. In moments of stress, societies do not lack explanation, they drown in it. Competing narratives fragment consensus. Authority becomes contested. Truth feels negotiable. This weakens response, because action requires agreement. In historical collapses, narrative breakdown preceded institutional failure. People stopped agreeing on what was happening. Without shared reality, coordination became impossible. Modern systems are particularly vulnerable to this dynamic, because perception travels faster than verification. Confidence erodes before correction can occur. This does not imply deception. It implies speed. Speed is neutral. It amplifies whatever it touches, including doubt. One of the most underestimated accelerants of collapse is the loss of temporal horizon. When people stop believing in the future, they stop investing in it. Long-term planning disappears. Maintenance is deferred. Institutions hollow out. This is not nihilism. It is rational adaptation to perceived instability. History shows that once societies enter this mindset, recovery becomes extraordinarily difficult. Because rebuilding trust requires time. And time is precisely what collapse removes. This is why collapse often feels moralized. People search for villains. They want intentionality. But collapse rarely requires malice. It requires miscalculation. The miscalculation that tomorrow will resemble yesterday closely enough to delay change. In earlier eras, this miscalculation had limits. Distance slowed contagion. Time softened impact. Today, miscalculation is amplified. Mistakes propagate instantly. Confidence evaporates globally. correction lags behind perception. This creates a paradox. The more advanced a system becomes, the less time it has to adapt. Sophistication reduces slack. Slack is survival. This is not an argument for regression. It is an argument for humility. History's lesson is not that progress is dangerous. It is that progress without redundancy is fragile. Empires that survived longest were not the most efficient. They were the most adaptable. They tolerated inefficiency. They accepted decentralization. They preserved trust, even at the cost of speed. Modern systems struggle with this trade-off. They prioritize optimization. Optimization removes buffers. Buffers absorb shock. Without buffers, shock becomes collapse. The sensation many people experience today that something feels unstable despite apparent normality is historically familiar. It is the sensation of misalignment, when surface continuity masks structural strain. History tells us that this sensation is not paranoia. Nor is it prophecy. It is perception catching up with structure. The question is not whether systems face strain. They always have. The question is whether societies recognize strain early enough to adjust meaningfully. In the final part, we will confront the most difficult question of all. Not whether collapse can be prevented, but whether recognition itself can restore resilience. And what responsibility remains when systems are already drifting toward fragmentation. History's most severe judgments are never delivered loudly. They arrive quietly. They observe. They wait. Civilizations are not overthrown by history. They are examined by it. And what history examines most rigorously is not power, but coherence. The capacity of a society to understand itself accurately, to align its institutions with reality, to adjust before adjustment becomes humiliation. The tragedy of collapse is not ignorance. It is delayed clarity. Empires rarely misunderstand the dangers they face. They misunderstand their proximity. They believe the system still has time, that reforms can be incremental, that legitimacy can be preserved through explanation rather than performance. History offers little patience for such assumptions. The final stage before collapse is not chaos. It is normality continued too long. Daily life persists. Institutions function outwardly. Language remains familiar. And yet, something essential has shifted. The future no longer feels reliable. People sense it not intellectually, but viscerally, in small hesitations, in diminished expectations, in the quiet recalibration of plans. This internal adjustment precedes any visible breakdown. Once people stop trusting the future, they stop building it. This is the moment from which recovery becomes rare. History records very few societies that regained coherence after widespread loss of future belief. Because belief is not an argument. It is an atmosphere. It cannot be commanded. It cannot be restored through instruction. It emerges from consistency over time. Consistency between promise and outcome. Between authority and competence. Between sacrifice and reward. When that consistency erodes, belief follows. And without belief, power becomes performative. The final illusion of empire is the belief that collapse is an event. It is not. It is a condition. A condition in which coordination fails faster than control can compensate, in which complexity overwhelms command, in which legitimacy drains away faster than it can be replenished. At this point, systems do not collapse because they are attacked. They collapse because they are no longer obeyed, not through rebellion, through indifference. People comply superficially. They disengage privately. They hedge quietly. The empire continues to exist on paper, but not in practice. History does not condemn this. It records it, without outrage, without drama, merely consequence. This is why moral panic is so often misplaced. Collapse does not punish immorality, nor does it spare virtue. It responds to structure, to whether incentives align with survival, to whether institutions adapt before stress exceeds capacity, to whether truth is prioritized over reassurance. Empires fall not because people are evil, but because systems become dishonest with themselves. They protect identity at the expense of reality. They preserve narratives long after evidence has changed. They reward loyalty over accuracy. And eventually, accuracy asserts itself regardless. This is the cold elegance of history. It does not negotiate. It reveals. Yet history also offers something rare: perspective. It reminds us that collapse is not fate, it is probability. Probability shaped by choice, timing, and humility. The societies that endured longest were not the most powerful. They were the most self-aware. They noticed strain early. They decentralized before fragmentation. They accepted inefficiency to preserve trust. They valued redundancy over optimization. They understood that resilience is not strength. It is slack. Room to fail without falling. Room to adapt without humiliation. Room to absorb shock without panic. Modern systems struggle with this wisdom. They're designed for performance, not patience. For speed, not reflection. For scale, not subtlety. This does not doom them, but it does constrain them. Understanding these constraints is not pessimism. It is maturity. The purpose of historical analysis is not to predict collapse. It is to sharpen perception, to recognize when confidence is asserted rather than earned, when stability is performed rather than maintained, when explanations multiply as coherence diminishes. These moments matter, because response is only possible before belief fully dissolves. After that, events move faster than intention. This is the responsibility of the informed observer. Not to panic, not to proselytize, not to dramatize, but to notice, to think clearly, to resist comforting simplifications, to value structural truth over emotional reassurance. History suggests that societies are saved not by slogans, but by seriousness, by a culture willing to examine itself honestly, by institutions capable of adaptation rather than defense, by citizens who understand that participation is not passive. The future belongs neither to optimism nor to cynicism. It belongs to attention. If this examination has felt demanding, that is deliberate. Serious history does not entertain. It refines. It sharpens the mind. It unsettles complacency. It replaces certainty with understanding. This is not material to be consumed and forgotten. It is material to be revisited, discussed, questioned, shared not as persuasion, but as invitation. Because ideas of this depth survive only through thoughtful exchange. If there is someone whose judgment you respect, someone capable of conversation without slogans or reflex, this is precisely the kind of reflection worth sharing, not to alarm, but to think together. And if work like this, slow, researched, unsentimental, still deserves a place in public life, then continued engagement matters, not as allegiance, but as quiet affirmation that complexity is worth confronting. History does not demand fear. It demands attention. And attention, consistently applied, has always been the beginning of resilience.